I mean, it's 6:05. Do you want to go ahead and get started?
Sure.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, to our viewer, thank you for being here. And to anyone who is watching this after the fact on YouTube or wherever we have it, thank you for joining us as well. Cassie, would you like to introduce the topic that we are going to be talking about today?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the Garden of Gethsemane.
I'm so excited.
I am too.
When you presented this topic to me, like for a minute, I was like, is there really going to be that much? Because it's really only like 10 verses. It's in all four gospels, but it's just like 10 verses. I was like, is there going to be a whole lot in there? And yeah, there is.
there is, and even in my study, I have found it's just a very important place.
Yeah, it is.
So the setting, if you will,
Mhm.
of the garden, Jesus has just had the Last Supper with his disciples, and then he goes to the garden to pray. On his way there, um, and I talked about this in my Jesus study. Some of the disciples are arguing over who's the greatest. So childish, but um, they kind of go through this back and forth, and Jesus has this comment with Peter that Satan wanted to sift him like wheat.
Mhm.
But Jesus prayed that his faith would maintain strength and that it would not fail. And not just him, really, all of the disciples, that they would be able to keep their faith because
Mhm.
Jesus knew what was coming.
Yes. Which
Um,
which I don't want to take too much like input right now, but it makes the contrast really interesting between the fact that they're like childishly bickering on the way to the garden,
like they have no idea what's going on.
despite the fact that he's told them multiple times. But
Right.
I digress.
Um, so we have the Last Supper that just occurred, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about something else that happened during the Last Supper. So anyway, they go to this garden called Gethsemane. And do you know what Gethsemane means?
I do know what it means. I looked it up in my studies.
Okay, do you want to share?
Sure. So it's a kind of a compound word, and it means press of olives. So the olive press.
Yes. I actually Googled Gethsemane because I wanted to see geographically where it was. And
Mhm.
this is what Britannica.com says. It says Gethsemane is a garden across the Kidron Valley on the Mount of Olives.
Yep.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. And
um,
go ahead.
no, I was like, well, that's definitely the place.
Yeah. I found in my studies that though there are several people who claim to know exactly where it is, and if you go to Israel, you can go to a place where you essentially pay money to see it. But basically, there's no way to know for sure that that's what
Right.
it was. We just know that it was somewhere on the base or at the towards the bottom of the Mount of Olives, which is to
Right.
the east of Jerusalem.
Yes. So they believe that Gethsemane was a olive tree grove. And like you said, they don't know the exact location, but there are a couple places in that area which geographically match, could be that garden, where there are still olives growing and they still produce crop. And these trees, they recently dated them. Again, here I go down my archaeological, and they found that some of these trees are thousands of years old and they
Mhm.
still produce crop, which I thought was just crazy.
Oh yeah.
Um, so I want to talk a little bit about the significance of the olive tree.
Hmm.
So there's, you know, typically when you think of Israel, you think of the fig tree,
Hmm.
right? Well, the olive tree also has significance in the Bible. And the Hebrew word for olive tree is zayith, and I'm terrible with pronouncing my Hebrew, but zayith, I believe. But they believe it comes from the root word. It's spelled the English spelling is ZHH. So I have no idea how one would begin to pronounce that. Z or Zeev, which
Okay.
means to adorn, beautify, bloom, or glory.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the olive oil obviously was an anointing oil.
Mhm.
So the olive tree is known as the tree of anointing. And it
And
was
he,
in this olive grove that Jesus went to pray.
mhm.
Did you also know that the first symbolism or the first story demonstrating the symbolism of the olive tree was in Genesis?
Noah.
Yep. When the
Really?
dove brings the olive branch. That's the
Mhm.
first time that we see this olive tree or olive branch.
Mhm.
So yeah, though that's the significance of the olive tree. We've talked about the location of the garden. You had another comment that you wanted to talk about.
About the Last Supper.
Mhm.
Or okay, so I do. It's not necessarily super relevant to our conversation, but I just find it interesting, and I want to send all of our people off on this tangent to study it. But
Yeah.
um, the timing of Jesus' death is fascinating, and the what's happening right now in the story is Jesus and his disciples have just celebrated the Last Supper, and we always just kind of assume, at least I have, that that took place at the same time that everybody else was eating the Passover meal, right? When in reality, it's not. So the Jewish day starts in the evening at 6 p.m. and then ends at 5 p.m. the next day, and then turns over to a new day. And so they're actually eating the Last Supper at the start of the day of preparation. So this is when everybody else is getting ready to eat Passover, but they're not actually eating it. And so they ate it on the same day as everyone else, but towards the beginning of the day when everybody else eats it at the end of the day. Um, and so I think that's just really important to note that they've just eaten, but there was no lamb at that Passover meal like there traditionally would be
Right.
because they had not been slain yet. They would not be slain until the next day. Um, go study that on your own. I'm not going to give away the cool secret behind that, but I encourage everyone to go study that. But yeah, there was no lamb there. So they've only eaten bread and wine up to this point, and Jesus is about to enter into the garden with only bread and wine in his system. That's all he's eaten. So I just think that that's interesting going into this to understand that that supper was not the big feast that you would anticipate it being.
And then you also said something about Luke in Luke chapter 22 and the swords. So tell me about
Yes.
that.
So in Luke, let me open my Bible really quick. We haven't read a single verse yet.
I know before we get to the next section, we need to read through
The first
the
portion. Yeah.
first portion. Yeah.
Yeah, we're still
Actually,
in
we
there.
probably should read through the entire thing and then break it down.
Yeah, I would like. Okay. That's recorded. Fun for me. So in Luke chapter 22, um, in this section that includes verse 38. So um, and they are going out and okay, so Jesus talks to them while they're walking to the garden. He looks at the disciples and he says, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? And they say, no, we lacked nothing. And he says, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. Essentially, what he's saying there is when you went out before, everyone was at peace. Now a war is about to start. So you're going to have to be diligent and knowledgeable about the fact that you're going to need to defend yourself and you're going to need to use common sense. And they turn to him and they say, look, Lord, here are two swords. And his response to that is, okay, that's put it away. Literally his response. And he said to them, that's enough. Um, so not only is that hilarious because the disciples crack me up. They're really like children sometimes, but what they're saying there is he has been telling them over and over again, I'm about to be killed. I'm about to be delivered. I'm about to go into this war. And they're saying, here are the swords with which to defend yourself. And he's saying, no, you're not getting it. I don't get to defend myself. You need to defend yourself. So I just thought that was interesting as he's going into the garden, that they're like, here, defend yourself. And he's still saying, no, I'm making this choice. I am giving myself up willingly.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have set the scene before this passage of scripture. So I'm going to read from the book of Matthew.
Awesome.
I'm going to read chapter 26, verses 36 to 46.
Okay.
Okay. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you might not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And he again came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.
All right. So our first section that we're going to cover is really only the first 2 verses of this, right? So I'm going to read those again really quickly, just so that we have them top of mind. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, the olive press, and he told his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John, he began to be grieved and greatly distressed. So the first thing that I notice here is that there are 2 layers. He first goes and says to all of his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And then he takes with him the 18, is what I've heard them called before.
The 18.
Yes, the 18, Peter, James, and John. And so these 3 are commonly sort of picked out of the group and taken to special events, so to speak, to these times of intimacy with Jesus. So this is one of them. Another one of them is on the Transfiguration Mount. They go with him there. And I think there's one other time when he pulled them aside, but I don't really have to sit to find it.
There is, so I think I have it.
I dropped my notes on the ground earlier, and then I lost my
They
spot.
scatter. So he took those 3 with him when he went to heal the daughter of the synagogue ruler.
Thank you.
Yeah,
exactly. So anytime he's essentially doing something extremely private,
yeah,
he brings them with him. So that was the first
thing. Jesus besties.
They are Jesus. And what I found interesting is every time the disciples are listed in the Gospels, they're listed in the same order, and they're grouped into 3 groups of 4. So Andrew was technically a part of this group, because when they're listed in the Gospels, he's included with James, John, and Peter. But
he was the one who introduced Peter, wasn't he?
Yes. He was a disciple of John the Baptist.
That's right.
So I don't exactly know whether that influenced Jesus's decision to not include him in that group, but I have a feeling it does have something to do with it. And then I also thought about this. I did a little bit of researching on Andrew. He was the biggest, strongest, brutest of all the disciples. And so in my mind, if I were Judas and I was going to betray Jesus and I saw Andrew sitting there, I'd be like, maybe this isn't the right time. I'll come back another day. So again, I have no evidence for that, but it was just something that I thought while I was reading it. It was like, that's interesting. Maybe that has something to do with why he wasn't included in that. But so another thing that I noticed here is they have had to cross, and we're kind of going back into the scene setting here, but they've had to cross over the Kidron Valley and the brook of Cedron, or brook of Kidron. This area is named 3 other times, and all of them are in the Old Testament. And I found a couple of those interesting. So it's named in First Kings, it's named in Second Chronicles, and it's named in Second Samuel. Now the meaning of Kidron is basically it's Valley of Darkness.
Oh,
I know, right? And one of the times that it's mentioned in the Old Testament is when David is fleeing from Absalom. David is the rightful king, and Absalom is trying to overthrow him, and he is weeping and fleeing across this valley. Because of what's about to happen, because he's being chased after, essentially. And so I think that there's sort of some beautiful parallel there, that Jesus is just taking the same path as David, to flee what is coming. And he's not fleeing it the way that David did, but I wonder if Jesus thought of that as he was crossing this valley. And then the other 2 places are similar, is that they've crossed this valley, and it's known, and some people think that it's the Valley of Dry Bones from Ezekiel. There's a lot of meaning in this valley. But the thing that really stood out to me is they have to cross over this brook. The brook drains from the temple. And what would happen is they would they would slaughter the Passover lambs, and they would take the entrails and the parts that they didn't offer as a sacrifice, and they would throw them into this creek, and the waste would flow out of the temple and down through this valley. And so Jesus has to cross over it in order to go to the garden to start praying in it. And it makes me wonder if he saw that and thought of what was coming. And all of these things, he's crossing the valley, he's crossing over this creek, he's thinking about what's about to come, and all of it is just compounding as he is entering into the scene that we're talking about right now. So that's what I got out of this section, but I know that you have a lot more that you got out of it too, and I want to hear that.
yeah. So I want to talk a little bit more about the garden setting. So we talked about like what happened right before and the importance of, the name, the olive trees, but it's not lost on me that Jesus would go to meet his father in the garden.
Mm. Oh, yeah,
Once upon a time, long, long ago, there was a man who was created to care for a garden. And guess what? He would walk with his father daily. He and she, Adam and Eve, they both would walk with their father in the Garden of Eden. The other thing that I thought was really cool is Jesus actually ascended and will return to the Mount of Olives.
Yeah,
could very well be the same place. Yeah. In Acts chapter 1, verses 9 to 12, it says, "And when he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, 2 men stood by them in white robes and said, 'Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who is taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven.' Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day journey away." So I thought that was also interesting that this is where he's going to meet the Father, because I think this location has a very important part to play.
Absolutely. It's one of the mentioned parts of Jesus's, when it comes to prophecy, the Mount of Olives is talked about constantly.
And I don't think this is the first time. Well, I know this is not the first time that this is where Jesus has gone, because in Luke, when Luke captures this story, he says, it's Luke chapter 22. He says, "And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him." And then in John chapter 18, verse 2, it said, "Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples." So this isn't a place that he just went. And we know based on scripture that Jesus often went away to pray privately. Yes. That was his practice. Just a couple of the passages I have that actually mention Jesus going to the mountain to pray. Luke chapter 6, verses 12 to 13, Mark 3, verse 13, Matthew 14, verse 23, Mark 6, verse 46, Matthew 15, verse 29. I'm sure there are more. These are just a couple of the ones that I captured that actually specifically call Jesus out going to the mountain, praying. Again, I think this is obviously it's part of God's plan. He had to go someplace where he could be found. So he went back to this place he often goes for prayer. The last thing in this section that I thought was interesting are the different terminologies. And we'll see this again in another section. But the passage that we read in Matthew, he says, remain here and watch with me. Again, in Mark, he says, remain here and watch. In Luke, he says, pray that you may not enter into temptation. He doesn't say watch. And so I was wondering, like, what's the contrast here? Like, what's the difference? We know they just had the Last Supper. But one of the things that we didn't talk about that happened during that supper, and I'm just going to read a little bit more right before this section in Matthew 26. This is verse 21 to 25. It says, and as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, is it I, Lord? He answered, he who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Judas, who would betray him, answered, is it I, Rabbi? He said to him, you have said so. And we learn in Luke 22 that Judas was actually indwelled by Satan. So I think this statement isn't just a call to watch with the eyes. And this is something that I learned in my prior Jesus study. I think, Jesus has them there clearly for the purpose of hearing his prayer. It's not just to, sit here and guard.
Right.
They're there to hear his prayer.
What would he need a guard for?
Right. And if you haven't read John chapter 17, for anyone listening, highly recommend reading that chapter, but is a beautiful prayer by Jesus about the protection of the faith and the people that will remain here after he leaves. But he's asking the Father to protect them because he loves them so much. And the other part of it is, which we'll talk a little bit later, I think has to do with the end times, which I think is really fascinating, but we're going to save that for the last section. I think it's
okay. Well, we've only hit the first two verses in true Rini or Kiki and Rana fashion. We are 2 verses in and 30 minutes gone. No. So next section we're looking at is, if we're reading in Matthew, it's just verse 39. So do you want to read that and then start talking about what it is that you discovered?
Yes. So verse 39 says, and going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. So he says, let this cup pass from me. Obviously, what he means by cup is what you have intended, what I have, like, what's in store for me. And in Revelation, we know that the bowls, the cups, they contain really not nice things. So it's harsh. But what I find interesting is Jesus has known this for a while. In Mark chapter 10, verse 38, I believe it was the sons of Zebedee, their mother comes to Jesus and says, can you save the seat at your right hand for my son?
Mhm.
And Jesus looks at them and he's like, you don't know what you're asking.
Yeah.
He says, are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Because it's like a real big deal. And
Yeah.
so he uses that same terminology. In John 18:11, and you might mention this passage too, Jesus says, put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?
Mhm.
Again, he references the cup that the Father has given me.
Yep.
In 1 Corinthians 10:21, I thought this was fascinating. It says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of the demons.
Mm. So what does the cup represent? Like, what's another word that you can input for cup in these situations? I found this fascinating. There's two things that most people think of, and both are correct.
Well, so for me, based on what I'm reading from this, it's suffering.
Yes, judgment. When
Yes.
it talks in Revelation about the bowls being poured out, which by the way, bowls are much bigger than cups.
Yeah. Right.
But God, oftentimes God is talking about his wrath being poured out of a vessel, of a cup.
Right. Vessel. Mm-hmm.
The other symbolism of it is what Jesus did at the Last Supper with his disciples. What did
Yes.
he do? He had them drink from the cup. And what did that mean?
It was a blessing. I mean,
It's a
it
new
was,
covenant.
yeah.
It was a promise.
Yep.
So by drinking this cup, not only is Jesus saying, I'm going to take that wrath, I'm going to accept the judgment, but he's saying I'm entering into a covenant in doing so. So it's double-sided. I love you too.
So the other thing is, Jesus says, not my will, but yours. And this has been a theme throughout his earthly ministry. And in fact, in the book of John, I have a feeling that is what John intended to focus his book about, was God's
Mm.
will instead of anything else. Because John's gospel is very different than the other three.
First of all, he likes to call people out.
but I think that the purpose of his gospel is helping people understand that being Christ-like means not seeking your will, but seeking
Yeah.
God's will,
Yeah.
whatever that is.
Yeah.
But Jesus says, not my will, but your will. He says it 6 times in the book of John.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. And there's a passage that I think puts all of this in perfect perspective.
All right, let's hear
And
it.
it's from the book of Hebrews.
Okay. Love the coffee chapter.
I know. Hebrews 5, verses 7 and 8. It says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered.
Mm.
Even though God could have saved him, I mean, God could have done it.
Yeah.
And at that point, I think Jesus understood the pain that he was going to face because he was bearing the weight of all of the sin. I mean, God couldn't even look on that sin.
Imagine how bad we feel as believers when we do something that we know was wrong.
Right. But
And we deserve that feeling.
yes, but Jesus was still obedient through it.
So he felt it completely unjustly, which I don't know if you've ever been hurt unjustly, but it makes it hurt a little worse.
Yeah, it stings. So those are the things that I pulled out of verse 39. What about you?
So it's not in Matthew. I believe it's in Mark or Luke. Let me see if it's in Mark 35 and 36 here. Because it reads a little bit different. So in that passage, he says, and going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, and not what I will, but what you will. This is the only time Jesus is recorded as having called God Abba.
Oh, really?
The only time. The word Abba is only used 3 times in the entire New Testament, and this is one of them. The other 2 times it's used by Paul.
Interesting.
So I know you know, so I'm going to ask you so that our viewers can learn. What does Abba mean? What does that term mean?
Well, I thought it meant father.
It does. It does. But in the Hebrew language and in Jewish culture, Abba is a very personal, endearing term that a very small child calls their father
Like papa
or daddy.
or daddy.
So this is not just father, which is stoic.
Formal,
Yeah.
and he's crying out to his daddy.
Passion, yes, which is just heartbreaking,
That is heartbreaking.
but also beautiful.
Yes.
Um, and one of the things that I've heard a lot of people mention is they say, Jesus was so distressed about what was about to come. And I don't think we go enough into that. And probably the reason of that is because we honestly don't know exactly what was going through his head at this time. But I don't believe he was distressed about the physical suffering he was about to experience. It was all spiritual.
I wondered that too. And that's because of something I learned with the term pray that you won't be led into temptations, or the term watch.
So is that something we haven't talked about yet?
Right. We won't talk about it until the next section.
Okay. All right. I'm going to leave that then. I'm not going to ask you any more about it. But I believe that there is a deeper, richer happening going on here that is causing him so much distress. I almost wonder if it is a conflict between his flesh becoming sin and his spiritual deity
I think
conflicting.
maybe. I think it's likened to disappointment.
Heart, yeah, his heart is shattering
Yes.
because he's about to be killed by his own creation. All of this is only happening because his creation did not obey him in the first place.
Yeah. It
But
I
his
don't want
heart
to
is
give
a
it I don't want to give it away because like it's really cool,
okay.
but like
I won't touch any spoilers then. We can move on from this point. But
okay.
it's something that I thought I was like, there's something we're not getting, and maybe we won't ever get it, or maybe we'll get it in the next section.
Maybe for me, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is really cool.
I'm so excited. I love those moments. So another thing I noticed, which you already talked about a little bit, was that it mentions that Jesus goes away from them multiple times. And so there's this pattern, like you said, of Jesus going away and going alone to pray. And I think that that's something really important to note as believers, and something that the Lord's been teaching me is I'm married to a wonderful, godly man, and we pray together often, but I have neglected my personal prayer life. And so that's one of the things that I got from this is I was like, okay, this is a theme that God's been showing me over the last couple of weeks, and he keeps talking about it. So it must be really important. So that act of going away, he's not abandoning disciples to go and pray by himself. He
Right.
wants them there. He wants their support in the form of them being there physically with him. But he still goes away to be alone with his father. And so I think that's something important that we can take away from that. But you did already mention that a bit. The other thing I noticed was it says that Jesus falls on his face. Do you know the typical prayer posture of the Jews in those days?
I don't, but when I picture it in my head, it's like um knees kind of tucked under, like
So
with your head in between your hands. Is that not it?
that's a Muslim prayer posture. Um, the Jewish prayer posture was actually standing.
Really?
Yes. So their prayer posture was standing, and you see this in the scripture where it talks about the people who go out and pray in front of others. They go stand in the streets to pray.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, it was not a custom to kneel while praying. That was not typical of the time. He is kneeling because of the anguish he is feeling. He cannot
He
stand.
can't stand.
He is under that much duress.
No.
Um, and I feel like we may have I don't know if we skipped a part or if I don't want to skip ahead, but have we talked yet about when he comes and he says, my heart is distressed to the point of death? Has he said that yet?
He said that. Yeah, he said that in the
He did
first
say
section. He said, I'm
that. Okay.
sorrowful even to death.
Even to death. So I missed something in that section that was really fascinating, and I'm going to touch on it really quick. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, there it is, section 1. I missed it. So in that little passage, there are 3 different words used for agony in that one little section. And they're all different. So the first one is, I'm not going to pronounce these well. These are Greek. I'm not going to pronounce them well. Lupeo is the first one. This is used several times throughout the Bible, and it means to be deeply, deeply distressed, or to be, when he says to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. That's what this word is. For example, King Herodias, when he finds out that he has to behead John the Baptist, this word is used to describe the anguish that he felt. That's the depth of that anguish. Another example, the disciples, when Jesus first told them that he was about to die, they felt this kind of anguish. The rich man who Jesus said, go sell everything you own if you want to enter heaven, he felt this kind of anguish. So those are the three examples that stood out to me of that. Then there's another one, and the other one is bereo. And this is to be burdened, to be weighed down, and a mental oppression caused by inevitable death. So this is used to describe the disciples' eyes.
Their eyes?
Their eyes in this passage, which we're about to get to them falling asleep.
Yes.
We're not quite there yet. So I'm going to kind of gloss over that one, and we're going to talk about it in the next section. But the third one, and this is the one that is used to describe Jesus in this moment when he's starting to pray, and it is ademonia. And it means to be distressed, to be troubled, to be sated to loathing, to be in distress of mind, and to be full of heaviness. This one is used only one other time, and it is used to describe Paul, or Paul uses it when he says that, I don't remember who it was. It starts with an E. It's a Greek name. Anyway, the man who was with him who became very, very ill. And the church was worried about him because they found out that he was ill and might die. That is the only other time that this word for distress is used. And it's used in Greek culture to describe the deepest form of depression you can possibly understand.
Oh my goodness.
So it is worse than all of those examples that I gave you about King Herodias and all of those. He is in a deeper depression than anything that can be described with any other word. I can't believe I missed that in the last section.
No, that's actually kind of a good segue into this third section. Are we there? Because
I have one more note and then we're
okay.
there. So the last note that I have is kind of similar to what you mentioned, actually, because you talked about how there was another garden, right? So, and I wish I had written down in my notes who said this because it's fascinating. It was in the David Gusik's commentary that I read. And he said, how fitting is it that in the first garden, man was faced with temptation. And instead of going to God in prayer and asking for strength, he fell, and it affected all of mankind. And now we see another man in another garden facing temptation, but instead he goes to God, he finds strength, and it affects all of mankind.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, it's a very interesting parallel. Okay, now we're on to the next section.
Okay, so for this section, should we read? Do you want to go ahead and read the Mark passage?
Sure. And then I have it in my notes that it's probably going to be best if we go one verse at a time
Yeah.
and read what we found, because this one's getting juicy. But we're going to be in Mark chapter 14, starting at verse 37. You want me to read the whole thing and then we'll go back and start one verse at a time?
Sure.
Okay. So Mark 14:37 says, and he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. How far am I going? 42.
I think to 42.
Yeah. And again, he went away and prayed this, saying the same words. And again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. All right. So the first verse we're going to talk about is 37, which says, and And he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Do you have anything in that?
So, okay, let me look here at my notes. So here's something that I had alluded to in section 1 and 2
Okay.
about them sleeping when Jesus had asked them to watch. So right before this, if you look at in the book of Matthew 24, Jesus was telling them that no one knows the day or the hour. And he said in chapter 25, he talks about the parable of the 10 virgins. Now,
Mm-hmm.
5 of them are wise and 5 of them were foolish. The 5 wise virgins brought oil for their lamps, the foolish ones didn't. And it says the bridegroom was delayed.
Mm-hmm.
And then at midnight, there was a loud noise. They heard the bridegroom come. The 5 wise virgins had the oil, so they went out to meet the bridegrooms. They told the foolish ones, we don't have enough to share. You'll have to buy some in town. So while they're gone, the bridegroom comes. The 5 wise ones go with him, and they close the door, and that they miss their opportunity. I think this is partly why Jesus was so distressed, and partly why he told them to watch.
Okay.
Because we have to remember, when Jesus came to earth, he gave up everything except for his title, Lord.
Mm-hmm.
All the omnis. He was
All the
fully
omnis.
man, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And as a human without any omnis, I don't know anything about the universe. I don't know what's going to happen in 5 minutes from now.
Right.
I only know what I know and what the Holy Spirit has given to me.
Mm-hmm.
That's all Jesus had as a man, right?
Right.
And in my study of Jesus and his life, the most fascinating thing I found was actually just how human he really was. And I know that sounds probably flippant, but I think when Jesus came as a man, he thought, this is it. I only have to come this one time.
Mm.
And then as his ministry started going and unfolding, and he started to see what was actually happening, he even says, I don't even know the day. Only the Father knows. The Son doesn't even know.
Right.
So he was hoping, this is it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with my 12 disciples. We're ministering. We're going to take everybody now. This is it. It's the only time I'm coming. I knew I had to come. This is it. This is the time.
Yeah.
But as he gets closer, he's starting to realize this isn't it. But maybe, because I haven't died yet. So stay awake and watch. Because maybe there's still time. You know what I mean?
I do. I would have to study
I
that.
think that's also partly what his prayer was.
That
Father,
this would,
please let this be the time. Take the cup from me. But not my will, your will.
Yeah. That's a brain bender. That's one that I would really have to like contemplate and study.
Yeah.
Get deep into. Because and when you were talking about, this is kind of a little bit on a tangent, but talking about the humanity of Christ, he really was fully human. And so have you ever experienced something deeply supernatural?
Deeply supernatural.
So I'll share a little bit about why I'm asking that. And I don't want to go too in depth just because this is going on a public forum and I'm going to look like a crazy person, but I have experienced something deeply supernatural. And I'm not going to talk about exactly what it is. Anybody on here who knows me, you're welcome to reach out and ask, and I will happily tell you. But it's exhausting. I was wiped out. And I think anybody who's experienced probably not even the full weight, but the weight of something supernatural on your human body, it's almost unbearable. And so we know that Jesus in the garden was experiencing something very supernatural. He
Yeah.
was dealing with the sin of all humanity for all time, and it began in that garden.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like I said, that's a little bit of a tangent off of what you're talking about, but I just, having experienced something supernatural before, I can't even imagine how he was
Right.
even forming words at this time is fascinating to me.
But that leads us into
Oh,
the
wait, I have one more note.
agony.
I have
What?
one more note on 37 before we move forward.
Yeah.
So what does he call Peter here?
Simon.
He hasn't called him that since when?
Since before he changed his name.
Since the day he called him to be his disciple. He
Yeah.
changed his name to Peter the moment they met, and he called him Peter from then on. Can you imagine if someone called you something completely different than your name, Rana, for your whole time of knowing them, and then all of a sudden, in this moment, they come to you and they use your government name?
Right. Oh, am I in trouble?
He says, "I'm sorry, who are you talking to?" But I can't imagine in that moment the shock that that must have caused him. And it's probably because Jesus was trying to tell him, this is serious.
Serious. Yes.
And you're behaving like the old you.
Yeah. Did you know the relationship between Jesus and Peter? I actually read a published blog that there are over 20 interactions with just Jesus and Peter.
They had a very fun relationship, at least from
He,
what I can see.
Jesus was personally invested in him.
Very much so.
And in the book of Acts, we see that Peter like becomes the leader of the
Of the
disciples.
church, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, they have a very special relationship.
Very much so. And I love that because Peter is very imperfect. He is
Yes.
headstrong and stubborn, and he is rash,
Yes.
and yet Jesus adores him.
Mm-hmm. And
And I think
continues
that's
to
so
pour into
fertile.
him. He
Very
doesn't
much so.
ever see him as a lost cause.
And you never see Jesus become impatient or frustrated with him.
No, not in a negative way. I think Peter pushes his buttons.
Well, yeah. I mean, the get behind me Satan part was probably
I was gonna say, like, there's parts where I'm
that he's
like, I don't know, that looks like that could be interpreted as a little bit of frustration.
maybe a little bit. But the point stands. He uses his government name here, and I think that that's
Yeah.
just an interesting note. But as you were saying, we are ready to transition. That next verse says, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Do you have anything else on that verse, or should we move to the next one?
Uh no, we can go ahead and go to the next one.
All right. So the next one says, "And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words." Any thoughts on that?
Well, I do have thoughts, but not until actually the third time.
Okay. All right. So I would like to actually switch over into the Matthew account here for a second.
Okay.
The Matthew equivalent of those verses, because it says something a little bit different. It actually might be a little, but so he comes to them and says, "Could you not stay awake and keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep actively watching and praying." He went away for the second time, found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy. So that leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words once more. It must be in Luke. But go ahead. And so you said he goes and prays 3 times, and you have something to say about that, right?
Yeah. So it says that he comes and sees them sleeping 3 times and he goes away and prays 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing is repetition. He says the
And
same
three,
words for
yeah,
all 3 prayers. And when someone says something 3 times in the Bible, it is super duper important to them. Like it's emphasized. They want you to make sure but this is Jesus saying the same words 3 times to God, the Father.
yeah.
Not my will, but yours. But if I don't have to drink this cup, please take it away from me. And then further, the number 3 itself represents completeness. He couldn't have prayed any more than he prayed here. He poured it
Right.
all out, everything that he had.
Yep.
He poured out in this garden.
Um, my thought on all of this is, I'm actually going to save it for, I have a little bonus section at the end.
Okay.
I'm going to save it for that. I don't want to spoil it. Um,
Do you want to read the Luke passage?
so I actually just realized that the reason I wanted to read the Luke passage is because of the bonus section.
Well, there's another part in the Luke passage that
Oh,
I'd like to touch on also.
absolutely. Okay, so I have it pulled open here. So 43 through 46. So that says, I'm going to skip. Can I skip 43, the bonus part?
Yeah.
All right, so we're skipping 43. So 44, and being in agony, deeply distressed in anguish. This is the amplified version, by the way.
Okay.
Extra words. And being in agony, deeply distressed and anguished, almost to the point of death, he prayed more intently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down to the ground. When he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. Oh, that's what I was looking for. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not fall into temptation." So the thing I was trying to find is where it says their eyes were tired from sorrow. So a lot of commentaries will comment on how flippant they were about the situation, that they just fell asleep because they didn't care. And that's not what we see there in the Luke account. It says that their eyes are heavy from sorrow. And that's that word that I was mentioning before about
Like
deep.
they cried themselves to sleep.
Yes. They were so sorrowful that they could not, that feeling you get
Yeah.
when you,
And you wake
yeah.
up, your eyes are all puffy.
Yes. I hate it. So that's the state that the disciples were in. It wasn't that they didn't care. And Jesus knew that. Jesus knew that they cared and that they were exhausted and just being human.
Right.
But anyway, what did you have to add for that?
So, by Jesus' own words, he says that his soul was very sorrowful, even to death.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just understanding that you are about to voluntarily, at any time, because he could have turned around and disobeyed God and ruined it for all of us.
True. He could have.
But he is voluntarily going to give up his life for all sin, all sin. And
Past,
I
present.
don't know. I mean, maybe he did, but maybe he didn't even know how much sin that actually was going to be, because that was 2,000 years ago.
Mm.
Did he know people were going to continue sinning for 2,000 years and that he was going to bear 2,000 years worth of sin?
In his full deity, yes, but in his humanity, no.
Right. That's a lot of stress.
It is. And it also kind of explains his frustration with them sleeping. If he's saying that
Yes.
you're falling into temptation and sleeping, you're adding to it.
Right. And did you know that being under extreme levels of stress can cause a condition? It's called hematidrosis. I probably didn't say it right, but it's sweat. Like you sweat drops of blood.
The capillaries beneath your skin literally burst and mix
Yes.
sweat glands.
And according to a study by the National Institute of Health, this condition is most commonly caused by extreme fear and intense mental contemplation.
Which goes back to that third word I explained for depression.
Yes.
Yep.
I mean, we so often we put Jesus in this box where he's God. Like this was an easy choice for him.
Mm.
Like of course, it's like a no-brainer. But yes, he was God in identity, but not God physically. He was human.
Yes. He
Human.
endured.
He had
Or
human thought processes, a human temptations,
tempted, yeah.
desires for self. You have to know he was thinking about how can I get out of this?
He was fighting his body's own natural survival.
Yes, fight or flight.
He
All
had
of those
to
things.
constantly fight. He had to literally pull his body into submission at every moment.
Yet he was the only human in the history and the future of the entire world that overcame them perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean that he felt it any less.
Imagine. Okay, so do you have any like phobias?
I don't really like snakes.
Okay, I was actually talking to our grandma about that the other day. I'm like, okay, that's legitimate, like in spiritual and physical forms. Snakes are scary. But let's say you have a fear of heights and there's a cliff and there's a tightrope, and you are told that you have to walk out on the tightrope and someone's going to cut it. Imagine the fear. You're going to your death. You're going to a terrifying death. It's going to be brutal. It's going to be horrific. And you have to force your body to do it. I don't know many people who could.
I don't think I could.
And that's not even counting the spiritual side of what Jesus is going through. Yeah. That is something very difficult to overcome. So are we at the bonus part?
We're at the bonus.
Yes, I'm so excited for it. But we're doing great on time, by the way. I would just like to say. We're killing it.
What did we say, an hour?
We did. We said an hour.
So we're just going to be right over, right?
Well, we started at 6:05.
Oh, okay. We can do it. We can do it.
Yeah. All right. So the last verse that we did not read is Luke 22:43. And I think we both have a point on this. And I'm really excited.
Yes.
Now, this is right after he has prayed. It says, now an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. I'm going to let you give your point first, and then I'm going to give mine last.
Okay, I have a lot. But
okay.
Quickly, I will just say, we learned in the book of Daniel that this is a gift angels have to humans. Angels can strengthen humans.
Yes.
But this is the second time in my study of Jesus' life that angels have come to minister to him when he's in agony or suffering.
Right.
Do you know when the first time was?
When he was tempted.
Yes. They came to him.
In that valley.
Yes, in the valley after the 40 days. He was starving. Yes. He'd been tempted with all the things. And Matthew 4:11 says, then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him.
Did you know? So something else I found in my study, which I have not looked up my sources on this, so don't quote me. It may not be true, but there are theories that when Satan tempted Jesus to jump, it was at the Garden of Gethsemane. There's a ledge, according to where they believe the Garden of Gethsemane is now, and they think that's where Satan told him to jump. Anyway, I have no proof of that, and it may not be true, but kind of a cool note.
But yeah, no, that was it just for me, because
you said you had a lot.
Well, to me it feels like a lot.
Oh, I mean, it's important.
Yes. I thought it was super interesting because I just recently finished a study of Daniel, and Gabriel strengthens Daniel when he is before Jesus, because he can't, it's Jesus in his glorified form.
And he can't stand it.
And he can't stand up because he's in sinful flesh. And so Gabriel gives him the strength to be able to stand. And kind of like you said, if you've experienced anything supernatural, it wipes you out.
Yeah.
Even Daniel told Gabriel, he's like, I'm fine if you want to keep giving me these visions, but they weren't like, I physically can't handle them. I'm going to need strength. And so Gabriel gives him strength.
Right. Yeah. And you also see it, Isaiah, when he enters into the presence of God, he falls on his face and says, I am a man of unclean lips.
Yep.
And an angel has to come and pick him up.
and that angel touches him with a coal
on his lips.
Like, you're clean.
Yep. Done.
You're good.
All fixed. I burned bad stuff off. Okay. So I have a question for you.
Okay.
And I'm so glad we're ending with this. This is like the perfect ending. So we have 3 accounts here, technically 4, 3/4. We have the account of Matthew. Yes. Is that firsthand or secondhand?
Matthew would be secondhand.
Is it? I thought he was just second.
The majority of Matthew, he got. No, that one could be firsthand.
Yeah, he's firsthand. Mark, secondhand. Whose account is that? Who did he dictate from?
Mark, who did he walk around with? Was it John?
It's Peter.
Peter.
The third account that we have is Luke, which he just did his own like intellectual study. He used multiple firsthand sources. Like he's like a research paper, like a thesis on Jesus.
Yes.
And then we have
Matthew and Luke also had the opportunity to talk to Jesus' parents.
Yes. And then we have John. which is another firsthand account.
Yes.
Right. So it says that they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus goes, he prays, he comes back, he finds them sleeping.
Yes.
Okay. Yet, in these accounts, we have recorded what Jesus said, that there was an angel that ministered to him. How do we know that? Because these guys were unconscious the whole time. And Jesus is about to be led to be crucified.
Matthew must not have been.
No, they were. Shush. Sorry. Think about this. Think about this, because this proves something to people who like to discount the Bible. They are sleeping. He comes back 3 times and says, stop sleeping. So this entire time they're sleeping. There's no way they saw the angel. There's no way that they heard everything that Jesus said. They had to get it from where?
Other witnesses? Or God?
Jesus.
Yeah, God. I mean,
so think about this. If you and I, you're like, oh, duh, nope, like obviously, because you and I are believers. Imagine you're an unbeliever listening to this story.
Okay.
And they tell you that these disciples were sleeping. So there were technically no firsthand accounts that saw all of this. And yet we know that Jesus said these things and that there was an angel that ministered to him. The only possible person who could have told him those things was Jesus himself. And yet, what immediately happens after this? He's killed.
Oh, he didn't have time to tell him.
It proves the resurrection. He had to have told them when he came back.
Yeah. He didn't have time to tell him before he died.
No. Immediately he was delivered up to be crucified.
I never thought about that. That's so cool.
I'm so glad we're ending on this. He told them when he came back. The crucified Jesus was like, okay, now write this down. Let me tell you what happened in the garden.
Since you all were sleeping.
Right? Like, now I have to come back and tell you these things. Like, that is the only way that they have a firsthand account, is Jesus had to have told them.
That's so cool.
I know. And that's all I got. That was my last point.
That's a great way to end.
I thought so too. Well, this was so much fun. I liked doing it this way.
Me too.
And this is a pretty good time, like for our very first time.
I know. I'm shocked. We did it in an hour.
Usually we have how many hours of?
Like, I think the last time we did it, we had over 2 hours that we had to somehow figure out how to edit
Noah's Ark. I had to edit down like 7 hours from Noah's Ark, and we still ended up with 2 hours. It was crazy, but no, this was great. I really enjoyed this.
Yay! We got to do it again.
I know. We should make this a regular Thursday night thing. I'm in.
Yes. So somehow we're going to put a poll up. We're going to post the video. Yes. We're going to put a poll up. So if you want to see more of these, vote that you would like to see more of them. Also, if you have any recommended topics or stories that you would like us to study,
yes,
you can share that too.